Khark Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, 50 kilometers off the Iranian coast, like a problem that no one has fully solved and everyone has noticed. It is small, less than 15 square kilometers of flat coral and carbonate rock, rising just enough above the Gulf's surface to be visible from the tankers that pass it every hour. It is also, by any serious accounting of what moves through the Persian Gulf and what has the capacity to stop that movement, the single most strategically significant piece of real estate in the waterway. The oil export terminal on Khark's southern shore handles the majority of Iran's crude oil exports. The military infrastructure that has accumulated on the island over 4 decades of intermittent conflict and continuous strategic competition handles something different. The command, coordination, and forward basing capacity that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy requires to conduct the kind of maritime denial operations in the northern Gulf that its doctrine has been designed around since the tanker war of the 1980s. An island that exports oil and commands the force that can stop other nations' oil exports simultaneously is not a strategic paradox. It is a strategic concentration, a point at which the leverage that the Iranian state exercises over global energy markets and the military capability that defends that leverage occupy the same piece of coral rock in the northern Gulf. The facility that the target folder described was not the oil terminal. The oil terminal was visible, documented, protected by international norms whose violation would carry costs that the targeting decision had to weigh against the operational benefit. The target was what had been built underground on the island's northern end, a command node for the IRGC Navy's aviation component that coordinated the helicopter gunship and maritime patrol aircraft operations across the northern Gulf, integrated the sensor picture from the network of radar stations and passive monitoring buoys that the IRGC had distributed across the Gulf's northern reaches, and hosted the communications infrastructure that connected the island's command function to the fast attack craft flotillas, the coastal missile batteries, and the mine-laying assets that formed the operational layer of the IRGC Navy's northern Gulf presence. It was, in the language of network analysis, a node whose removal would degrade the coordination quality of the northern Gulf denial architecture without eliminating any individual capability. Degraded coordination is not eliminated coordination. But in maritime operations, degraded coordination produces the specific failure mode that naval planners call blue water confusion. The condition in which individual platforms with intact capabilities cannot integrate their actions into a coherent, operational effect because the command layer that translates individual capabilities into coordinated operations is no longer functioning. Blue water confusion produces opportunities. The targeting decision was made against those opportunities. The target folder's collection program had been complicated by a factor that was specific to Khark Island and that had no direct parallel in any of the mainland facility strikes in the series. The island's oil export infrastructure created a persistent human presence and a persistent commercial satellite imagery baseline that made construction activity impossible to conceal at the surface, and that had driven the Iranian military engineers to a depth and a concealment approach that was more aggressive than anything the collection had previously characterized. The underground facility on Khark's northern end had been constructed through vertical shafts, sunk from the floors of what appeared in surface imagery to be maintenance buildings for the island's utility infrastructure, buildings whose function was genuine and whose secondary function was the access point for a construction program that had deposited its excavated material into the Khark Island road fill program mixing military construction debris with civil infrastructure work in a ratio that had kept the volume signature of the underground construction below the threshold that the collection's anomaly detection algorithms had been calibrated to flag. The concealment had worked for 9 years. It had worked until a collection method that is not characterized here had produced, in the 10th year, a document precise enough to support a targeting solution. The depth the document specified was 39 meters, shallower than the Mohajer plutonium facility, shallower than the Alborz command node, shallower than most targets in the series. Shallow was not easy. Shallow in the specific geology of Khark Island. The coral and carbonate formation of a Gulf island whose subsurface was not the consolidated limestone of the mainland formations, but a mix of cemented coral, carbonate sand lenses, and biogenic material, whose density variations were less predictable than any terrestrial geological formation the program had previously addressed, presented a fusing challenge that the weapons engineers had approached with the specific caution that unpredictable density variation demands. The fusing algorithm had been developed against core samples from Khark's accessible surface outcrops and from analogous Gulf Island formations. The engineers had assessed it at 79% confidence. The lowest confidence assessment in the series, reflecting the geological unpredictability rather than any failure in the weapons system's capability. 21% was document. The decision was made at a level of the command structure that was comfortable with 79%, because the alternative, no strike, carried a certainty of continued Northern Gulf denial operations that the operational assessment had weighted more heavily than the 21%. The mission was authorized. The additional challenge that Khark Island presented was strategic rather than technical. The island's oil export function meant that a strike that produced surface effects, visible damage to the terminal infrastructure, disruption to the export operation, anything that the commercial satellite imagery that continuously covered the island would capture, and that international observers would characterize as an attack on Iranian oil export capacity, created political and economic consequences that the mission's authorization had explicitly excluded. The weapons employment solution had to be precise enough that the underground detonation produced no surface manifestation that could be attributed to an attack. No crater, no subsidence visible in imagery, no disruption to the terminal operations. The strike had to be, in every observable dimension, an absence rather than a presence. Something had happened. Nothing could be seen. The precision requirement had driven the employment solution toward a single weapon, rather than the two-weapon sequential approach that deeper targets had required. Single weapon at 39 meters in a variable density formation, with a 79% confidence fusing solution. The confidence level reflected the geological uncertainty, not a capability shortfall. The weapon would reach the target. Whether it would detonate inside the command node rather than above it or through it was the 21%. The planners had accepted the 21% and had built the mission around what 79% looked like operationally. A command node eliminated, a surface that showed nothing, a northern Gulf denial architecture operating without its coordination layer. The B-2 Spirit, assigned to the mission, lifted off at 9:56 p.m. The routing to Khark Island from the forward operating location required 7 hours and 22 minutes, the second shortest in the series, a consequence of Khark's position well inside the Gulf, where a direct approach from the Gulf of Oman and through the Strait of Hormuz was geometrically possible without the extended interior routing that mainland targets required. The brevity was a planning advantage and a tactical constraint simultaneously. The short approach gave the EW architecture less time to characterize the Khark Island defense network before the aircraft entered the defended zone, compressing the adaptive frequency management cycle that had been the EW package's operational advantage in previous missions. The Khark Island defense architecture was unlike any previous target in the series in one respect that shaped every element of the mission planning. It was maritime. The systems protecting Khark Island were not the land-based air defense batteries whose frequency signatures, maintenance cycles, and operational patterns had been characterized through years of collection against mainland installations. They were naval systems. The same systems whose parameters were in the database, but whose operational behavior in a maritime environment differed from their land-based employment in ways that the signal's intelligence from mainland collection did not fully capture. Maritime radar environments differ from land environments in their clutter characteristics, their propagation conditions, and the specific ways that operators manage those differences in practice. An operator managing a maritime surface search radar over the Gulf has learned habits and protocols that differ from an operator managing the same system over a land surface. The EW package had been built against the database parameters. The database parameters were accurate. The operational behavior was partially estimated. The Khark Island defense included a naval variant of the S-300 system, the S-300FM, whose maritime-specific modifications had been documented, but whose operational employment patterns in the Gulf environment had been characterized only partially. An HQ-16 medium-range system provided inner coverage. 2 Tor M1 batteries covered the approach sectors, and a Mohajer-class reconnaissance drone operating from the island's airstrip on a patrol circuit, a system whose radar cross-section and flight profile were not a detection threat to the B-2, but whose optical sensors would, if it happened to be on a circuit that placed it at the right altitude and heading at the right moment, provide a visual acquisition opportunity that no stealth technology prevented. The drone was in the EW allocation in the sense that its patrol circuit had been characterized, and the approach timing had been selected to place the aircraft's transit through the drone's patrol area during the portion of the circuit where the drone was heading away from the approach vector. The characterization had been based on the drone's observed patrol pattern over 14 collection passes. 14 passes produced a statistical pattern. Statistical patterns have variance. The drone was in the allocation, and the variance was acknowledged, and the timing selection had placed the expected exposure at less than 3% probability of visual acquisition. 3% was accepted. The tanker contact at 1:17 a.m. completed in 14 minutes in conditions that offered a favorable current pushing both aircraft in the same direction. A meteorological coincidence that the boom operator noted in his log as making an already routine contact marginally smoother. The B-2 continued west and north toward the strait. The EW package activated at 4:31 a.m. local time as the aircraft entered the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. The activation was timed differently from previous missions, rather than the extended early activation that gave the Iranian operators time to begin frequency management responses before the aircraft entered the defended zone. This package activated only 19 minutes before the planned initial point, a compression driven by the short approach timeline and the assessment that the Khark Island operators, isolated on a Gulf island with a constrained communications architecture, would have less time to escalate their frequency management responses to a level that could threaten the mission before the weapons release window closed. 19 minutes of EW window instead of the 40 to 50 minutes that previous missions had used. The compression was a calculated risk. The planning had accepted it because the alternative, activating earlier and giving the island's operators more adaptive response time, was assessed as a greater risk than the compressed window. The S-300FM received its suppression from the Growler flight operating from the carrier group in the Gulf. The maritime S-300's frequency signature in the Gulf environment was performing within the database parameters. The Growler EW officer confirmed effective suppression within the first 90 seconds of activation. The HQ-16 suppression was managed by the land-based EW asset from the Gulf Partner Airfield. The Tor M1 batteries received their allocations from the same land-based asset on secondary frequencies. The three-system suppression was holding at 4:37 a.m. with 6 minutes remaining before the initial point. At 4:38 a.m., the Mohajer reconnaissance drone completed a turn at the northern end of its patrol circuit and began its southward leg. The southward leg placed the drone's optical sensors in a forward-looking geometry relative to the B-2's approach vector. Not directly, the drone was 2.8 kilometers west of the approach vector's centerline, and its forward-looking optical field of view had a horizontal sweep width at the B-2's altitude of approximately 1.4 kilometers. 2.8 kilometers lateral offset against a 1.4 kilometer sensor sweep width placed the B-2 outside the drone's optical acquisition envelope by 1.4 kilometers. 1.4 kilometers was the margin between the approach vector and the edge of the drone's sensor field. The approach vector had been selected to provide that margin against the characterized patrol pattern. The characterized patrol pattern was an estimate with variance. On this particular circuit, the drone was flying slightly east of its nominal track, not a deviation that the collection would have characterized as significant across 14 passes, but a deviation that, on this pass, reduced the lateral offset between the approach vector and the drone's sensor field from 2.8 kilometers to 2.1 kilometers. 2.1 kilometers against a 1.4 kilometer sensor sweep width was still a margin. It was a margin of 700 meters rather than 1.4 kilometers. The B-2 was outside the acquisition envelope. The margin had been reduced by 49%. It was still a margin. The pilot saw the drone on his passive warning system at 4:39 a.m. The drone's own radar emissions were logged and characterized as non-threatening, consistent with its reconnaissance role. The pilot noted the drone's bearing and the geometry between its current position and the approach vector. He assessed the margin. He continued. The initial point was at 4:44 a.m. The bay doors opened with a structural shutter that had characterized every weapons release in the pilot's 16 years on this platform, and that had never become entirely unremarkable because the body registers the departure of the weapon's mass as significant, regardless of how many times the number has accumulated. The GBU-57 released from the forward station. The aircraft corrected and turned onto the post-release heading. The bay doors closed. The weapon's descent through the surface infrastructure of Khark Island's northern end and into the carbonate formation below it produced the variable deceleration profile that the geological uncertainty had predicted. The first density transition came at 6 meters, a cemented coral layer whose hardness exceeded the baseline carbonate density by a margin the algorithm recognized as a coral cementation feature rather than a limestone density anomaly. Recognized. Adjusted. At 14 meters, a carbonate sand lens, lower density than the surrounding material, the algorithm recognizing the characteristic deceleration reduction and widening its depth uncertainty band accordingly. At 22 meters, the sand lens ended, and the density returned to a consolidated carbonate baseline that the algorithm interpreted as the primary structural formation above the command node. The consolidated carbonate ran from 22 meters to the fuse threshold with a consistency that the algorithm had not predicted. The formation was more uniform in this portion of the penetration than the surface collection had suggested it would be. The fuse threshold was met at 37 meters, 2 meters above the design detonation depth, within the widened confidence interval that the coral and sand lens transitions had necessitated, 2 meters above the command node's ceiling in consolidated carbonate rock. 2 meters of consolidated carbonate above a chamber ceiling at 39 meters total depth was not the same engineering problem that 2 meters above a chamber ceiling at 60 meters depth represented. At shallower depths, the confining pressure of the overlying rock is lower, which means the overpressure wave from the detonation propagates more efficiently through the remaining rock rather than being absorbed by the confining pressure gradient. The kill mechanism analysis had modeled this effect explicitly because the Khark target's shallowness made it relevant in a way that deeper targets did not. A detonation 2 meters above the ceiling at 39 meters total depth transmitted overpressure to the command node at a level the analysis had computed as within the range required for equipment elimination if the command node's structural specifications were at or below the median of the intelligence estimate. The intelligence estimate's median was what the collection had established. The 79% confidence assessment reflected the geological uncertainty, not uncertainty about what was in the chamber. What was in the chamber was characterized. The overpressure that reached it was within the required range. The communication servers, the sensor fusion processing equipment, the encrypted routing hardware, the coordination display systems that had been managing the IRGC Navy's Northern Gulf aviation picture went offline at 4:44 a.m. and 51 seconds. The surface above the command node showed nothing. The detonation's energy had been absorbed by the carbonate formation in a geometry that produced no surface manifestation, no subsidence, no visible ground disruption, no effect on the oil export terminal infrastructure 2 kilometers to the south. The commercial satellite imagery that passed over Khark Island in the hours following the strike would show an island that looked exactly as it had looked on every previous pass. The intelligence community's collection that was monitoring the island's communications traffic would show something different. The encrypted uplink between the Khark command node and the IRGC Navy's Northern Gulf assets, the fast attack craft flotillas, the coastal missile batteries, the airborne assets operating from the island's airstrip, went silent at 4:44 a.m. and 51 seconds. Not degraded, not intermittent, silent. The fast attack craft patrol commander, who had been receiving sensor fusion updates from the command node's maritime picture every 4 minutes, registered the update cessation at 4:48 a.m., 4 minutes after the last update. He attempted to re-establish the uplink through the primary channel, the backup channel, and the emergency frequency. Silence on all three. He reported the communications loss to his flotilla commander at 4:51 a.m. The flotilla commander attempted independent contact with the Khark command node through the naval communications network. Silence. He escalated the report at 4:53 a.m. The escalation reached the IRGC Navy's Northern Gulf Sector Command at 4:58 a.m. The sector commander, receiving a report of complete communications loss with Khark Island's command node during an active surveillance period with no prior warning of any technical event, issued an immediate sector alert and dispatched an emergency communications team by fast craft to the island at 5:03 a.m. The team would reach the island at 5:41 a.m. and would report upon arrival that the island's surface appeared entirely normal, no fires, no visible damage, no indication of any event, but that all attempts to contact the underground command facility through its surface access points had produced no response. The surface was unchanged. The facility beneath it was not. The B-2 was past the strait and 260 miles into its egress when the emergency communications team was dispatched. The data link confirmation code had been transmitted at 4:46 a.m. The planning element that received it began cross-referencing the communications traffic, monitoring data against the timeline. The Khark command node, uplink cessation, at 4:44 a.m. and 51 seconds was logged at 4:48 a.m. when the fast attack commander reported it, 4 minutes and 9 seconds after the event. The cessation timestamp aligned with the weapons employment timeline within the margin of GPS propagation delay and transmission latency. The planning element confirmed the strike at 5:02 a.m. The island that the commercial world had been watching for decades had experienced something that no commercial observer would ever see. The northern Gulf denial architecture had been degraded at its coordination layer. The degradation would be invisible until the next operational scenario required the coordination that was no longer there. The numbers that closed the package: 7 hours and 22 minutes of flight time, 1 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator in a single pass, 1 Mohajer drone on a slightly eastward track that reduced the optical margin from 1.4 kilometers to 700 meters, still outside the acquisition envelope, still a margin 49% smaller than planned. 1 fusing detonation at 37 meters, 2 meters above design depth, within the widened confidence interval, kill mechanism effective at median equipment specification. 79% confidence fusing solution against a Gulf Island coral carbonate formation, the widened interval that the geological unpredictability required. No surface manifestation, no imagery signature, no visible evidence that anything had occurred. The communications uplink that had been coordinating IRGC Navy, Northern Gulf aviation operations, went silent at 4:44 a.m. and 51 seconds. The fast attack commander who first noticed the silence noticed it 4 minutes later. The 4 minutes were the difference between when the event occurred and when anyone knew it had occurred. The island gave nothing away. Maritime power is not concentrated in ships or aircraft or missiles. It is concentrated in the ability to coordinate those things, to make a sensor on one platform and a weapon on another platform and a command decision at a third location into a single, coherent operational action that produces an effect none of the three could produce independently. Remove the coordination, and the ships remain, and the aircraft remain, and the missiles remain. They cannot produce the effect. Khark Island's command node had been the coordination. The coordination is gone. The island is 39 meters above it and looks the same as it always has. The Gulf is the same 21 miles wide. The northern denial architecture is the same collection of capable platforms operating without the layer that made them collectively dangerous. The coral holds the silence. The uplink does not.